Catching a serial killer usually takes a great deal of time and focus, but occasionally, police stumble across a vital clue that blows the case open. Even more rarely, they stumble across the killer themselves. Number 5. Ronald Dominique preyed on those at the fringes of society, people who he thought wouldn't be missed, who were desperate for money or would allow themselves to be tied up. Most of his victims were gay, but for those who he thought were straight, he would claim his non-existent wife was looking for someone to hook up with, but she was shy and requested the target be tied up first. He had taken the lives of more than 20 young men by the time he was caught, often dumping their bodies in reed fields where rodents would accelerate decomposition. By the time he met Ricky Wallace, he'd been killing people for almost a decade, but police only recently started to link the crimes together as the work of a serial killer. Ricky was an ex-con who had recently been jailed due to drug use. Despite being on parole, he was still using drugs and was on crack cocaine when he met Dominique in 2006. Dominique passed him several times in his truck while Ricky was out walking, before offering Ricky a lift. He showed Ricky a photo of a woman, his supposed wife, and Ricky agreed to go back to the trailer where Dominique lived. However, he was extremely cautious about being in a vulnerable position. One of the officers working on the case put it that he'd been screwed over before and didn't trust people easily. He refused to be tied up and Dominique didn't want to force him, so he agreed to let Ricky go. Ricky didn't think much of it at the time, but he did bring it up to his parole officer at the next meeting. His family were concerned because Ricky matched the description of a number of the victims that police had linked to the supposed serial killer. Police weren't entirely sure whether they trusted Ricky's testimony. He'd been on drugs at the time of the meeting, but he was able to take police back to the trailer and identify Dominique in a lineup. Dominique voluntarily gave a DNA sample, which police were able to use to link him to a number of the recent unsolved murders. Once he was caught, Dominique confessed to 23 murders dating back to July of 1997. He was sentenced to life in prison. Number 4. The Hasties were known as a problem family. They'd committed countless petty crimes, and a number of people in their local community were thought to have a grudge against members of the family. Even a frail old lady had sent them death threats at one point. So when their home in Hull, England was set on fire, police believed they were dealing with one of the many people who considered the Hasties their enemy. Police followed countless leads for months on end, but struggled to come up with anything to tie any one person to the crime. In the end, police concluded it was likely set by someone who had acquired the services of one of the family members who worked as a male prostitute. Frustrated at the lack of progress, the person leading the case accused multiple homosexual men of starting the fire, hoping one would confess. One of these countless people questioned in this manner was George Peter Lee. Born Peter George Dinsdale, Lee had changed his name to that of the kung fu movie star after he finished school. He had epilepsy and partial paralysis, leading to him attending a school for the physically handicapped. He grew up unwanted by his mother and never knowing his father, though he did get on relatively well with his stepfather. He also had learning difficulties and left school without any qualifications. He was often mocked by those who knew him and was frequently bullied by members of the Hasty family. When police told Lee they knew who had started the fire, as they had done with everyone they questioned, Lee admitted that it was actually he who had started the fire, but he hadn't meant to kill anyone. The police officers were stunned, but Lee went on to claim responsibility for other deadly fires as well. Lee was a pyromaniac who'd started more than 100 fires. Most of these were inconsequential, though others caused significant damage and many led to loss of life. The victims were usually people Lee had no grudge against. As he said, he hadn't meant to kill anybody. He just needed to set the buildings on fire. Others, like the Hasty family, had bullied him or in some way angered him. At first, police believed that he was taking credit for fires that he didn't commit. He was perceived as mostly harmless by the general community. Some of the fires had even been deemed accidental by the fire department, but when police took Lee to fires they knew he hadn't committed and asked if he was responsible, he didn't pretend that he was. He stuck only to the ones he knew he was involved with. He was eventually found guilty of 15 cases of manslaughter and spent the rest of his life in a secure hospital. Number 3. There are countless stories of criminals handing police evidence they believe to be untraceable, but rarely is it as ill thought out as the case of Maury Travis. Travis holds the distinction of being the first serial killer to have his downfall come at the hands of the internet. Between 2000 and 2002, Travis took the lives of more than a dozen drug addicts and prostitutes who lived or worked in St. Louis, Missouri and East St. Louis, Illinois. He would lure his victims back to his home with the promise of money or drugs before ruthlessly killing them and filming his acts. He would leave their bodies in various locations around the two cities. At first, police were reluctant to name the crimes the work of a serial killer. There wasn't enough evidence to say that these weren't just separate crimes, and it was assumed that their deaths were the result of their lifestyle. The lack of publicity frustrated Travis, who wanted the same kind of fame as other serial killers. At one point, he discussed the deaths with the girlfriend of one of his friends. She was an intern at a news station. He told her the deaths were the work of someone he knew, a serial killer, and she should do a story on them. The woman went to her editors with the story, but it went nowhere. Eventually, police announced it was possible the crimes were connected, and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch wrote a story. Pleased with the coverage, he wrote a letter to the reporter from the Dispatch. Included with the letter was a map, which Travis claimed would lead them to number 17. He demanded a report about his latest victim be published in the next Sunday issue. The map did indeed lead to Travis's 17th victim, but it also led to Travis himself. He'd used a website to generate the map that he sent to the newspaper. Microsoft, the owners of the website, were able to tell police exactly which IP address had been used to generate the map. The address was connected to Travis's computer, and police were able to get a search and arrest warrant. The videos Travis created, DNA evidence, and tire treads were all used to solidify the case against Travis, who took his life before the case could go to trial. Number 2. The use of family DNA to catch killers is becoming more and more common as people seek to find long-lost relatives and find out where their ancestors came from. But it isn't always these commercial websites that provide familial DNA for investigators. For 14 years, women in China lived in fear of a man referred to as the Chinese Jack the Ripper. Young women dressed in red would disappear while walking alone. Their bodies would reappear not long after, often in the gruesome fashion that Jack the Ripper's victims had been found in. 11 people were killed in this manner, and women in the area refused to go out alone. Despite there being a wealth of physical evidence and a large amount of money available as a reward, police came no closer to catching the culprit. In 2002, the killings apparently stopped, leaving police with no new leads to go on. That was until 2016. An unnamed man was arrested for a minor crime in Beijing. He was put under house arrest, and as procedure, DNA samples were collected and tested. The man himself wasn't linked to any other crimes, but his DNA showed a close relative was at the very least involved in the deaths attributed to the Chinese Jack the Ripper. Given the crimes had already stopped, it would be easy to assume the culprit had passed away, but surprisingly this wasn't the case. Police screened the man's male relatives and came across a man named Zhao Xingyang, the man's nephew. Zhao had managed to avoid capture for so long as he lived in a small village and was able to get away without submitting fingerprints for a national identity card, as is the law in China. He'd been living a completely ordinary life for years. He had a family and 2 children who were incredibly shocked to find out that their father was suspected of such heinous crimes. He was arrested at his place of work and eventually confessed to the 11 murders. Number 1. In late January of 2012, police arrived at the home of a 23-year-old man suspected of breaking into a hardware store in Belinsky, Russia. They expected to be arresting a man who had stolen around 10,000 rubles, the equivalent of about $315, and a few knives. Alexander Bishkov admitted that he committed the robbery and had taken the lives of multiple people, some of whom were buried in his back garden. Alexander is believed to have taken the lives of between 9 and 11 people and consumed some of their body parts. The crimes began in September of 2009 when he met a 60-year-old man at a local tavern. He offered the man help completing some paperwork so that he could draw his pension. By the time they were finished, it was late, and he suggested the man stay at his house rather than travel home so late. Alexander took his life with a knife before dismembering his body. Over the next few years, Alexander targeted homeless and alcoholic men. He would lure them to a secluded place with alcohol before taking their lives and either dumping their bodies in the local rubbish dump or burying them in his garden, which overlooked the dump. He usually killed in the summer months, believing police would suspect seasonal workers rather than someone who lived in the area. About a month after his first kill, 3 bodies were found in the local town center. Rather than a seasonal worker, suspicion fell on a man named Alexander Z, a local man who was mentally ill. There was little evidence connecting this man to any of the crimes, but prosecutors were able to take one of the cases to court, and he was found guilty and sent to a mental institution. Alexander Bishkov didn't seem too concerned about the miscarriage of justice and continued with his crimes until 2012. At the time of his arrest, police were investigating the disappearance of 46-year-old Vladimir. Vladimir would be one of a number of victims recorded in a diary police discovered on the property. 9 names were mentioned in a diary that Alexander Bishkov kept, which outlined his crimes and the reasons behind them. According to Alexander, his girlfriend kicked him out, claiming that he was a wimp. Alexander wanted to prove that he was a wolf and was able to take the lives of dozens of people. He admitted to consuming the hearts of some of his victims as well as their livers and other organs. 6 bodies were found in his garden, but police found enough evidence to convict him of 9 murders. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to click that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.